Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Your Honors. May I recognize Vice Chairperson Romeo M. Aco from the 2nd District of Antipolo City, Honorable Francisco Paulo P. Ortega V from the 1st District of La Union, Honorable Zia Alonto Adyong from the 1st District of Lanao del Sur, Honorable Joseph Stephen Caraps Espaduano from Abang Lingkod Party List, Honorable Rolando M. Valeriano from the 2nd District of Manila, Vice Chairperson Johnny T. Pimentel from the 2nd District of Surigao del Sur, Honorable Ramon Rodrigo L. Gutierrez from One Rider Party List of del Sur, Honorable Joseph Stephen Caraps Espaduano from Abang Lingkod Party List, Honorable Rolando M. Valeriano from the 2nd District of Manila, Vice Chairperson Johnny T. Pimentel from the 2nd District of Surigao del Sur, Honorable Ramon Rodrigo L. Gutierrez from One Rider Party List, Honorable Jonathan Kit T. Flores, 2nd District of Bukidnon. That's it for our members, Your Honor. Thank you. Your Honor, I would also like to recognize Honorable Raul Angelo Gil D. Bongalon from Ako Bicol Party List. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Moving on to the next item in our agenda for today. We have here the minutes of the November 20 and 25, 2024 hearing. Do I hear a motion?
Mr. Chair, meetings and consider it as approved. So move, Mr. Chair.
Is there a second? Duly seconded. Is there any objection? Hearing none, the motion is carried. The reading of the minutes of the previous meeting is dispensed with, and the same are hereby approved. Matapos ang mga buwan ng masusing pagdinig at talakayan, marami na tayong natuklasan ng mga issue at gayon ay marami na rin po tayong nalaman ukol sa mga pangangailangan ng ating batas at regulasyon. Malayo na ang narating natin, ngunit alam pa rin natin na marami pa tayong kailangang busisiin. Isa sa mga pangunahing tungkulin ng Kongreso ay ang bumuo ng mga batas na tunay na maglilingkod sa ating bayan. Ang ating layunin ay hindi lamang lumikha ng mga batas, kundi bumuo ng mga batas na tunay na sumasailalim sa pangangailangan at hangarin ng bawat Pilipino. Sa bawat hearing tayo ay naglalakbay sa mga sulok ng ating mga batas, nagiging mata at tenga ng ating mga kababayan. Dito natin natutuklasan ang mga kakulangan ng ating batas. Mga puwang na bilang mga kongresista ay dapat nating sikapin na punan upang mas mapabuti ang ating sistema at ang kalagayan ng ating bansa. Bago ako magpatuloy, nais kong ipahayag ang taus-pusong pasasalamat sa lahat ng ating mga resource persons. Ang inyong dedikasyon ay nagbibigay liwanag sa madilim na landas ng katiwalian. Alam namin kung gaano kahirap ang inyong pagdalo sa mahabang pagdinig. Ang inyong presensya at pagsagot sa mga katanungan ng komite ay hindi matutumbasan. Aasahan po namin ang inyong patuloy na suporta at pasensya sa mga susunod na pagdinig ng komite. Nagsimula ang lahat na ito sa isang speech at isang request for investigation. Kung ating aalalahanin, nagkaroon ng privilege speech number 379 si Congressman Rolando Valeriano noong September 3, 2024 tungkol sa paggamit ng public funds ng Office of the Vice President mula 2022 hanggang 2024. At ang moto proprio na investigasyon sa manifestation ni Congresswoman Jervil R. Luistro noong September 2, 2024. Patungkol sa iba't ibang issue na nakapaligid sa budget ng Department of Education or DepEd. Kasama na rito ang hindi matagumpay na pagpapadala ng mga computer units sa mga teacher, estudyante at mga paaralan. Kaya't unang sinimulan namin ang pagtingin sa regular funds ng pangalawang Pangulo sa parehong OVP at DepEd. Para sa OVP, tinignan natin ang mga maranyang satellite offices kung ating aalalahanin, nakakabahala na halos kalahati ng budget ng OVP para sa 2023 at 2024 ay napunta sa pagtatayo at pagpapanatili ng mga satellite offices nito sa buong bansa. Ang tanggapan ng Vice President Sara Duterte ay mayroon ding napakalaking budget na 2.3 billion noong taong 2023. At dahil sa mga hindi maipaliwanag na gastos, noong 2024 ay kinailangang bawasan ang budget ng kanyang opisina sa 733.2 million. Ngunit para sa taong 2025, muli siyang humiling na bigyan siya ng 2.37 billion pesos. Tungkol naman sa DepEd, sa panahon na siya ay secretary, lumitaw ang mga pulang bandila sa procurement ng mga laptop para sa DepEd computerization program tulad ng rig bidding at pagsasabwatan ng mga bidders. Siya rin ay hindi nakapaghatid ng laptop na nagkakahalaga ng 9 billion para sa mga programa ng e-learning ng DepEd na tila isang napakalaking pagkukulang sa panahon na lumalalang pangangailangan para sa mga kagamitan ng edukasyon. Ngunit sa ating pagdinig at pagsusuri ng budget utilization ng DepEd at OVP, paulit-ulit lumilitaw at pinaka nakakabahala ang mga issue patungkol sa confidential funds. Napakalaking halaga po ang perang ito. Sa OVP, mula 4th quarter ng 2022 hanggang 3rd quarter ng 2023, mayroong nagastos na 500 million worth of confidential funds. Habang sa DepEd naman, mula 1st quarter hanggang 3rd quarter ng 2023 ay may 112.5 million pesos naman. Suma total ay may 612.5 million pesos, higit kalahating bilyon ang hinawakang confidential funds ng ating Vice Presidente. Natural bilang mga mambabatas na may mandatong masiguro na nagagamit ng wasto ang pera ng taong bayan, paulit-ulit rin naming naitatanong, saan napunta ang confidential funds? Sa ating pagsusuri, lumitaw ang mga sumusunod na kakulangan o gaps sa ating batas. Number 1, ang halaga ng fidelity bond para sa Special Disbursing Officers or SDO ay napakababa kumpara sa pondo na kanilang hawak. Tulad ni SDO Gina Acosta na may approved amount of bond na 8 million pesos pero ang kanyang amount of accountability ay 500 million pesos. Si SDO Edward Fajarda naman ay may approved amount of bond na 4 million pesos pero ang kanyang amount of accountability ay 50 million pesos. Pagpapatibay ng mga patakaran ng COA tungkol sa budget at mga technical resources. Pangatlo, pinaka nakakabahala rin ay tila walang maayos na sistema o paraan upang masiguro o ma-check o audit ng COA na nasa wasto ang paggasta ng mga confidential funds. At ikaapat, malinaw na mga alituntunin sa mga detalye na dapat isama sa physical and financial plan na dapat ding suriin ng mga ahensya ng pambansang gobyerno at hindi lamang sa Department of Budget and Management. Gayon din, ang kinakailangan ng pagsusumiti ng mas detalyadong ulat under oath ng mga accomplishment and liquidation reports kasabay na ang mga ebidensya ng accomplishment na ito. Sa terminong confidential ay tila ginagamit bilang isang panakip upang itago ang katotohanan mula sa atin. Para sa kaalaman ng lahat, ang confidential funds ay hindi discretionary allowance o funds ng isang ahensya. Hindi siya secret funds. Siguro po, panahon na upang harapin natin ang katotohanan na hindi lahat ng mga nahalal o nalalagay sa posisyon sa gobyerno ay pwedeng basta-bastang pagkatiwalaan. Kailangan pa rin ng safeguards pati sa confidential funds, sapagkat hindi maiiwasan na may mga nagtatakang gamitin ang pagka-confidential nito upang itago ang impormasyon at pag-aabuso sa tiwala ng taong bayan. Ginagamit nila ang salitang confidential upang magbigay sa atin ng peking ilusyon na kahit ito'y lihim, ang mga pondo ay ginastos ng tama. Ngunit bakit kailangan pa itong itago sa mga taong tunay na nagpondo nito? Ang mamamayang Pilipino ay may karapatan malaman kung saan napunta ang kanilang pinaghirapang pera. Para sa akin, kapag nagamit na ang confidential funds para sa kanilang layunin, wala nang dahilan upang hindi maging bukas at maging transparent. Walang mawawala kung sila'y mag-uulat kung paano ginastos ang mga pondo dahil tapos na rin naman na yung confidential operations kung saan ito pinaggamitan. Sa ngayon, naghahanda na po kami ng 2 batas upang masolusyonan ang ilan sa mga pagkukulang na natuklasan natin. Una, an act regulating the allocation and utilization of confidential and intelligence funds imposing penalties for misuse and misappropriation o ang Confidential and Intelligence Funds Act. Pangalawa, an act regulating special disbursing officers and imposing penalties for misappropriation o ang act regulating SDOs. Sa Confidential and Intelligence Funds Act, layunin naming tugunan ang tila maluwag na alituntunin batay sa Joint Circular number 2015-01. Sa mga hearing, nakita natin na pinapayagan ang mga resibo na may pirma lamang at hindi mabasang sulat kamay mula sa mga hindi nakikilalang tao bilang patunay ng liquidation. Panahon na upang magpatupad ng mas mahigpit na mga alituntunin sa paggamit ng mga confidential fund para sa mga confidential na gastos. Bagamat mahalaga ang mga confidential funds para sa pambansang seguridad, dapat itong balansehin sa tungkulin ng gobyerno na protektahan ang paggamit ng pampublikong pondo at ipatupad ang kinakailangang pagbabago sa batas, kaya taimtim naming hinihiling ang pag-aproba ng panukalang batas na ito. Samantalang ang Act regulating special disbursing officers and imposing penalties for misappropriation, layunin nitong palakasin ang proteksyon ng pera ng bayan dahil ito ay madaling maging target ng mga head of agencies at special disbursing officers na abusuhin ang paglabas ng pondo sa milyong-milyong halaga at bilyon-bilyon na walang wastong liquidation at walang takot sa parusa. Muli rin naming bibisitahin ang mga patakaran ukol sa fidelity bonds at ang inaprubahang halaga ng bond ng mga HOAs at SDOs dahil nakita naman natin kung gaano kalaki ang pagkakaiba nito na tila nawawala na ang kabuluhan, ang layunin ng pagpapataw ng bond mula sa simula. Bagamat marami pa rin katanungan tungkol sa confidential funds, sapat na ang ating natuklasan para magampanan ang ating mandato na gumawa ng batas para sa ikabubuti ng ating bansa. Ngunit hindi tayo titigil sa ating pag-iimbestiga sapagkat ang confidential fund ay isang bahagi na lamang ng budget ng OVP at ng DepEd. Marami pa tayong kailangang busisiin at suriin upang matukoy kung ano pang aspeto ng paggamit ng pera ng bayan ang kailangang punan ng batas. At para po sa kaalaman ng lahat, ang ating pong request sa PSA or sa Philippine Statistics Authority ukol sa pangalang Mary Grace Piatos ay ating pong na-receive ang kanilang tugon dito nung dated November 25, 2024 at dito sinasabi nila na base sa kanilang record ay walang ipinanganak na Mary Grace Piatos ang pangalan. Alinsunod dito, tayo po ay sumulat upang isumite ang 677 pang pangalan na nakalagay sa acknowledgement receipt ng DepEd kung saan tayo po ay binigyan ng tugon ng Philippine Statistics Office dated December 8, 2024 at dito kanila pong sinasabi na out of 677 individuals, 405 ay walang birth certificate o walang record sa birth certificate o pwede nating sabihin na non-existent. So, nandito po ang record. Muli, maraming salamat sa inyong oras at sama-sama tayong magsikap para sa mas mabubuting batas para sa bayan. I will now turn over the floor to my colleagues who have expressed interest in making a presentation to the public.
Your Honor, may I please be
I-
recognized for
Yes,
recognition?
Comsec, you're
Yes.
recognized.
Thank you. May I please recognize Honorable Raul Daniel A. Manuel from Kabataan Party List, Honorable
Very much,
Amparo
Mr.
Maria.
Chair. Magandang umaga po sa atin lahat. Sa mga kapwa ko miyembro ng Committee on Good Government and Public Accountability at saka sa publiko na nakasubaybay sa ating mga hearings. Isa po sa pinagmulan ng legislative inquiry na ito ay ang privilege speech ni Honorable Rolando Valeriano noong ikatatlo ng September 2024 delivered before the plenary session of the House of Representatives. Simple lang po ang pinaghuhugutan ng privilege speech na ito. Transparency and accountability on the expenditure of public funds. Sa pamamagitan ng mga hearings ng ating committee ay ating ginampanan ang tungkulin na alamin ang mga kakulangan sa ating batas at busisiin ang paggastos ng mga nakaraang ipinagkatiwalaang pondo ng bayan upang masigurado ang transparency at accountability ng ating pamunuan. Ulitin ko po yung sinabi ni Honorable Roland Valeriano. Tungkulin natin dito sa Kongreso na busisiin ang panukalang budget ng ehekutibo at ang paggastos ng mga nakaraang pinagkatiwalaang pondo ng bayan. Hindi pera ng pangalawang Pangulo, ang Office of the Vice President budget para sa taong 2022, 2023, 2024 at 2025. Pondo ng bayan yan. Kaya mayroong budget hearings ay para malaman ng madlang people kung paano ginagastos ng mga opisina ng gobyerno ang pondo ng bayan na pinagkatiwala sa kanila. Ito po ay ayon kay Honorable Roland Valeriano. Nagsimula po ang hearings natin sa pagbusisi sa paggamit ng mga nakaraang budget ng mga opisinang pinamumunuan ng Office of the Vice President. Ang pinakamalaking parte ng pondo sa socio-economic program na umaabot ng humigit kumulang 2.2 billion pesos for 2023 at 1.75 billion for fiscal year 2024, pero hindi po malinaw ang mga benepisaryo. Ayon po sa Office of the Vice President, ang mga components ng programang ito ay ang mga sumusunod: libreng sakay, pagbabago campaign, OVP food trucks, livelihood programs like Magnegosyo Taday and Peace 911, medical assistance, burial assistance, and public assistance. May listahan silang binibigay sa COA ukol sa mga benepisaryo ng mga programang ito. Pero kapansin-pansin po sa mga accomplishment reports o ARs na sinubmit nila para sa confidential funds na may tila hiwalay pa na pamimigay ng medical and food aid na kinukuha raw sa confidential funds. Halimbawa, noong February 6 to March 29, 2023, halagang 42 million in medical and food aid was given using confidential funds, while another 40 million noong April 25 to June 30, 2023 ang pinamigay kuno gamit ang confidential funds na hindi dumadaan sa regular na proseso ng procurement at aid distribution. Kinalaunan, ating natuklasan ang nakababahalang paglustay ng confidential funds ng Office of the Vice President at pati na rin ang Department of Education. Nakita natin na nababalot ng secrecy and lack of transparency ang paghawak ng Office of the Vice President at ng Department of Education noong sekretarya pa nito si Vice President Sara Duterte. Ang confidential funds na inilagak sa kanila noong taong 2022 at 2023 for OVP at 2023 for Department of Education. May mga resource persons tayo noon na hindi sumisipot o sinasabing wala silang personal involvement o participation. Mayroon ding ayaw naman mag-take ng oath upang magsasabi ng pawang katotohanan lamang sa komite na ito. Hindi exaggeration na sabihin na tayo ay dumaan sa butas ng karayom at napakadaming roadblocks para umabot tayo sa puntong ito. Ngunit unti-unti, sa pamamagitan ng ating masusi at porsigidong pagtatanong at sa paghahanap ng mga facts at ebidensya, ay ating natanggal ang secrecy na nagkukubli at nagtatago sa katotohanan sa kung ano ba talaga ang nangyari at kung saan o kanino napunta ang pondo ng bayan. Ito po ang money trail ng confidential funds ng OVP at DepEd based on the testimonies of Special Disbursing Officers Madam Gina F. Acosta ng OVP at ni Ginoong Edward Fajarda ng DepEd. The money trail of the confidential funds for both agencies looked exactly the same. First, after finishing all internal financial processes and documentations and securing all required signatories in the disbursement vouchers, including Vice President Sara Duterte herself, the SDOs received the land bank checks representing the confidential funds for each quarter. Malalaking halaga po ang mga ito. Sa OVP pa lang, nakakuha sila ng 125 million bawat quarter simula noong 4th quarter of 2022 hanggang 3rd quarter of 2023. Sa DepEd naman, 37.5 million kada quarter for 3 quarters or a total of 112.5 million. Suma total, 612.5 million po lahat. The SDOs themselves are the payees in these quarterly checks. The next step was for the SDOs to encash the confidential funds checks. Sabi po ni SDO Edward Fajarda, pina-encash po niya ang bawat isa nung tatlong 37.5 million checks sa Land Bank Dex branch, cold cash. Nilalagay sa 2 duffel bags at isang backpack ang cash. May kasama raw siya noong 3 beses na yon, nakilala niya lamang bilang Alan. Matapos mag-encash, dinala niya ang cash sa kanyang opisina sa DepEd. Sabi naman ni SDO Gina Acosta, para sa OVP confidential funds worth 125 million per quarter, pinapaingkas niya ang bawat cheque sa Land Bank Shaw Boulevard branch. Kasama niya si Assistant Chief of Staff Lemuel Ortonio at dalawang di mapangalanan driver sa pagpapaingkas ng bawat cheque. 4 na beses, inilalagay raw nila ang 125 million cash sa 4 na duffel bags. Parehong sinabi ni Acosta at Ortonio na mula sa Land Bank ay pumunta na sila sa opisina ni Madam Gina Acosta sa Office of the Vice President. As if it was all planned and orchestrated or part of a common design, both SDO Acosta and Farda said that the Vice President directly instructed them to hand over the cash representing the confidential funds to certain security officers. For DepEd, may itinalaga raw si Colonel Raymond Lachica, ang head ng Vice Presidential Security and Protection Group, ng isang security officer na nangangalang Colonel Dennis Nolasco, kung saan weekly nagbibigay ng pondo si SDO Fajarda amounting to 4 to 6 million per week. For the Office of the Vice President, si Colonel Lachica raw mismo ang security officer na buong pinag-aabutan ni SDO Acosta ng 125 million every quarter. Matapos di umano ibigay ng mga SDOs ang pera sa mga security officers na sina Colonel Nolasco at Colonel Lachica, wala na raw silang partisipasyon sa actual disbursement ng confidential funds. Wala silang ibang basehan sa kung anong nangyari sa pondo, kundi sa pamamagitan ng mga accomplishment reports na kailangang ihanda at isumite para sa liquidation ng confidential funds. Malinaw po sa kwento ng mga SDOs na hindi sila ang nag-disburse o nagbayad ng payments to the informants and other supposed payees ng confidential funds. Naturalmente, hindi rin sila ang gumagawa ng accomplishment reports kasi wala silang kaalaman kung papaano nagasta ang pera ng bayan. Ito po ang parehong sinabi sa hearing ni na SDO Acosta at SDO Fajarda. Sabi, wala po akong alam sa pag-implement po ng confidential activities dahil po hindi ko po iyan in line sa aking pinag-aralan. Your Honor, hindi po kasi ako ang expert diyan. Si Colonel Nolasco po, siya po kasi ang gumawa niyan. Ito po yung mga sagot ng ating mga resource persons noong mga hearing. It is also being made to appear that the acknowledgement receipts or the documentary evidence of payments, o tawag natin ay DEPs, supposedly also came from these security officers. Hindi po malinaw para sa akin ang kwento nila kung kailan inaabot sa kanila ng security officers ang acknowledgement receipts. Pero ang malinaw po sa mga AOMs ng COA na hindi sinubmit ang mga acknowledgement receipts kasabay ng kanilang mga liquidation reports. Mukhang parati na lang afterthought ang pag-submit ng acknowledgement receipts sa COA. Ito ay sinubmit kasabay ng mga letter response na pirmado ni Attorney Poa para sa DepEd at para sa OVP ni na Attorney Lopez and Ginoong Ontorio. Sila nag-submit ng acknowledgement receipts sa COA. Isa pong obserbasyon sa mga revelations na ito ng mga SDOs at mga ibang opisyal at dating opisyal ng DepEd at OVP, tila ba sinasaya tayong nililito, nililigaw at pinapagulo ang narrative sa kung ano ba talaga ang nangyari sa OVP at DepEd confidential funds. Kung inyong matatandaan, nung una ay sinabi nilang tanging ang mga SDOs lamang ang may kaalaman sa disbursement ng confidential funds. Ngunit nang magpakita na ang mga SDOs sa committee hearings at tinanong sila, wala din daw silang alam sa mga detalye patungkol dito sa mga confidential funds. Lahat po sila ay nagtuturuan. Pero sino nga ba ang pumirma sa mga accomplishment report at certification? Ang mga SDOs at si Vice President Sara Duterte. Kung totoo ang sinabi ni na SDO Acosta at Fajarda, malinaw na ito'y paglabag sa Joint Circular 2015-01 o ang guidelines sa paggamit at pag-audit ng confidential at intelligence funds na tila ginamit lamang sila bilang middlemen o pass-through ng pondo. Nananatiling misteryoso at tago kung saan talaga napunta ang confidential funds. Isang butas sa guidelines na dapat tugunan sa pamamagitan ng batas. Mula sa Davao City na lumaki noong siya ay mayor hanggang sa mas malalaking pondo ng mapas sa kamay niya bilang Vice President at DepEd Secretary, nakakapagtaka rin ang obsession ni Vice President Sara sa confidential funds. Marahil ito'y dahil sa kalakip ng opacity at antas ng secrecy sa pag-disburse ng mga confidential funds na tila nagiging daan upang ito'y abusuhin ng walang accountability. At pagbaliwala sa mga alituntuning ito ay isang paglapastangan sa tiwala ng publiko at sa prinsipyo ng pananagutan na dapat sinusunod ng bawat institusyon ng pamahalaan, lalong-lalo na sa opisina ng pangalawang Pangulo. Let me remind the public of what is at stake here. It would constitute graft and corruption if public funds are misused or misappropriated, or worse, if funds are diverted to personal use or benefit. And given the amount we are talking about here, this may be under the crime of plunder. We leave it to the investigative bodies of the government to investigate the crimes committed here. Meanwhile, our task now is to legislate measures that will leave no room for pilferage of public funds. Maraming salamat po. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Congressman Acop. Next, the Chair would like to recognize the Honorable Rog Gutierrez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Just taking off from where Congressman Acop started. But before that, I would like to start by saying that this has been one of the most fruitful committee hearings that I've had the pleasure in joining. Throughout the course of 7 hearings, we have brought detail to some long-held suspicions, the confidential funds of the OVP and DepEd that had been abused or malversed or maybe even taken. By abused, I mean that the relevant officers of the OVP and the DepEd took advantage of gaps in and in fact violated Joint Circular 2015-001. Mahirap po na problema ito. Pera po ng taong bayan ang pinag-uusapan dito, and unless we are aware of these gaps and violations, the legal regime cannot and will not change for the better. Today, I'd like to go through some of these violations as mentioned by Congressman Acop. The SDO has the sole mandate to disburse the CF, the confidential funds, and to prepare and submit the liquidation reports of cash advances with the relevant supporting documentation as prescribed under the Joint Circular. Siya lamang. On the other hand, a security officer is a personnel who has been officially designated as such to have access to security information. Klaro po ang kani-kanilang mga responsibilidad. Ang SDO po ang sa disbursement o ang sa pagbibigay ng pera. Ang SO naman, yung security officer naman, ay binibigyan lamang ng access sa impormasyon. To elaborate and para po sa kaalaman ng lahat, under the Joint Circular, the SDO is personally tasked with the disbursement and liquidation of confidential funds. Ang SDO ang tagabigay ng pera, siya lang under the Joint Circular. Natural lang po ito dahil ang SDO ang isa sa mga accountable officers or those public officers personally accountable when something goes wrong with respect to the utilization or disbursement of these confidential funds. And this is precisely the reason why kinakailangan may fidelity bond ang SDO. The fidelity bond is there so that if anything happens to the funds while it is in the custody of the SDO, sigurado na may maibabalik pa rin na pondo to the government through the bond and for the security of the taxpayers. Yung head of agency is also personally tasked to oversee the agency-wide use and disposition of confidential funds. Siya rin ang nag-a-appoint ng SDO. Because of the functions that burden the head of agency is also an accountable officer. Sa makatuwid, yung SDO po yung inaatasan ng batas natin na humawak at siguraduhin mapunta ang confidential funds sa naaayon na confidential expenses allowed under the Joint Circular. Hindi niya pwedeng i-delegate ang custody ng confidential funds dahil siya ang mananagot rito. Hindi niya pwedeng iutos sa iba. Hindi pwedeng ibigay sa security officer. In the case of SDO Edward Fajardo of the DepEd, while he has admitted to having encashed the 3 checks amounting to 37.5 million pesos each, he has also claimed that he did not know or had no way of knowing how the funds were to be utilized after handing them over to the designated security officer. Mr. Fajardo stated that since it was Colonel Nolasco who is the expert in confidential operations, it was Colonel Nolasco who supposedly made the disbursements of the confidential funds in different localities. It begs the question, sino po ba ang totoong special disbursing officer? Kung ang nag-iisang taong pinagdi-disperse ng SDO ay si Colonel Nolasco, kung pagka-encash ng cheque ay agara naman itong inaabot sa security officer. Whatever happened to Mr. Fajardo being an accountable officer under the Joint Circular? Kung wala siyang slightest idea kung saan napupunta o kanino ibinibigay ang confidential funds? Is his role in this entire process simply ministerial? We beg to disagree. Mr. Fajardo is not just a simple bagman that would withdraw the funds and turn over to the security officer. His role, as material as it is, carries with it discretion. Discretion to ensure the accuracy of the data in the liquidation reports and to be accountable for the disbursements from the cash advances of confidential funds. But Mr. Fajardo admitted that he merely relied on the documents evidencing payments submitted by the security officer. His failure to exercise the standard care and diligence required of and inherent in his function is the height of irresponsibility and is in clear violation of his mandate under the Joint Circular. At bakit po nangyari ito? Dahil ito raw ang sabi ng head of agency ng DepEd doon na si VP Sara na ibigay ang pera sa security officer. Same case po tayo with SDO Gina Acosta of the OVP. Ms. Acosta also admitted that the utilization and payment of the confidential funds involves her handing over the money to a security officer per the instruction of no less than head of the agency, Vice President Duterte. SDO Acosta also supposedly never knew where the security officer took or expended the confidential funds. She has only testified on the basis of the information supposedly fed to her, without certainty as to who are the actual recipients or payees of the confidential funds, whether they are even actual persons. In the past hearings, it has always been made to appear that Ms. Acosta for OVP and Mr. Fajardo for DepEd would have the most knowledge as the SDOs of the confidential funds. And we have always been made to believe that it would be the two of them who would be able to shed light on the discrepancies flagged by the COA and the other erroneous and false matters po na didiscover po namin through these hearings. Unfortunately, the SDOs themselves violated their own accountability, their own certifications in the liquidation report, with them disclaiming knowledge kung saan or kanino ba talaga pumunta ang bawat sentimo ng confidential funds. They violated a particular responsibility under item 4.15.1 of the Joint Circular, where they are supposed to certify at least two things: na sila ang accountable for the disbursements of confidential funds and that the expenses were incurred in connection with the agency's confidential activities. How can they faithfully attest to these kung binibigay lang din naman nila yung confidential funds sa ibang tao or empleyado? Basta mangako din sa kanya yung empleyado, halimbawa, nagagamitin yung pera pambayad sa informer or pang-conduct ng surveillance activities. Now let's move on to another reeling discovery na atin din pong na-uncover throughout the hearings. And this is with respect to the certifications issued by officers of the AFP, submitted by the DepEd to the COA in support of the DepEd's utilization of confidential funds for payment of rewards to informers. Matatandaang mahigit 15 million pesos of the confidential funds spending of the DepEd went to payment of reward to informers. This expense item has been flagged by the COA in view of the DepEd's failure to provide sufficient supporting documentation on the success of the agency's own information gathering and surveillance activities. Para po ipaalala sa nakakarami, under the joint circular, one of the conditions that must be met in order for an agency or office to use confidential funds to pay rewards to informers is supporting documentation evidencing the success of the information gathering and or surveillance activities on account of the information provided by the informer. Based on the respective accomplishment reports and the acknowledgement receipts submitted by the OVP and the DepEd, the total amounts utilized for the payment of reward to informers is 96,980,000 pesos for the OVP, covering the period from the fourth quarter of 2022 until the third quarter of 2023, and 21,921,000 pesos for DepEd from the first to third quarters of 2023. This is a total of 118,901,000 pesos. Napakarami po sanang classroom, tuition, sweldo ng guro, at iba pa ang pwedeng paggamitan nito. I stress also that this amount of money is just for supposed payment of rewards. It does not include all other things for which confidential funds were spent for. When inquired about the certifications which the DepEd submitted to the COA, former Undersecretary and Chief of Staff of the Office of the Secretary of DepEd, Mr. Michael Poa, admitted to having asked retired Major General Nolasco Mempin to secure said certifications from the AFP as a means to justify the use of confidential funds, despite DepEd not being directly involved in AFP-led activities. This was confirmed by former Education Undersecretary Major General Mempin, who stated on record that the DepEd has not released any single centavo to the conduct of youth leadership summits. The AFP officers themselves admitted that they did not receive any funding from the DepEd. The summits were actually funded by the budget of the Philippine Army and from funds of participating local government units, as confirmed by Colonel Boransing. Lieutenant Colonel Panopio also supported Colonel Boransing's statements that they were not aware that certifications issued by them would be used to justify the DepEd's confidential fund spending for informants. We eventually came to know that these certifications issued by Army Civil Military Operations Staff Officers Colonel Boransing, Lieutenant Colonel Sangdaan Jr., and Colonel Magtanggol Panopio for the youth leadership summits and information education campaigns in 2023 only showed that the fact that these events were successfully conducted at the different barangays in their areas of responsibility. This is yet another clear derogation of the joint circular. DepEd misleadingly made it appear that the agency used confidential funds for youth training programs, when in truth it was the AFP and the LGUs which actually shouldered the expenses from their respective confidential fund allocations. There was never any correlation between DepEd's supposed surveillance or information gathering activities with the AFP's successful conduct of its summits and campaigns in partnership with the LGUs. The DepEd took advantage of the AFP, rode in the coattails of the AFP, and misled the AFP into issuing certifications for a project that is not the DepEd's to begin with. And who could forget the many anomalies we were able to uncover with respect to the acknowledgement receipts or documents evidencing payment submitted by the DepEd and the OVP to the COA. With the select few that we were able to highlight throughout the hearings, ay marami po talagang lumutang na discrepancies na ni dapat ipasawalang bahala. We were able to trace the disbursements by counter-checking the dates indicated in the ARs, and we came to know through this hearing that DepEd SDO was able to complete a job that we believe is humanly impossible. An examination of the acknowledgement receipts submitted by the DepEd for the first quarter of 2023 revealed that Mr. Fajarda made disbursements for 38 consecutive days, and for 35 out of those 38 days, payouts were made to at least 10 to 26 people per day and for various purposes. For example, reward payment, incentives, supplies, rentals, traveling expenses, etc. This is something that could not be easily missed because the acknowledgement receipts, at least for the DepEd, have fields where the payees indicate the date they received the payment and their own addresses or location. We will recall that on February 21, 2023, or the very next day after SDO Fajarda encashed a 37.5 million peso check with the Land Bank, the SDO made 7 disbursements already in 7 different locations, as evidenced by the acknowledgement receipts recorded for that date. Hindi kapani-paniwala for one person designated as the SDO to have made disbursements in Malolos, Bulacan, Danao, Cebu, San Francisco, Agusan del Sur, Makati City, Negros Occidental, Negros Oriental, and Davao City all in one day. Worse, we found other examples of DepEd acknowledgement receipts of the same date but varied widely in terms of the localities where the payments were made. Plotting these on the Philippine map, within a single day on March 15, 2023, there were 26 disbursements which were made across 24 localities from Batanes to Davao del Sur, with total confidential expenses amounting to 1,870,000 pesos. On the 9th of March 2023, the DepEd, supposedly through its SDO, was able to make 20 disbursements over 18 localities all over the Philippines, with disbursements of confidential funds amounting to more than 1,400,000 pesos. And lastly, on February 25, 2023, there were 21 disbursements across 18 localities all over the country amounting to almost 1,400,000 pesos. All 3 examples reinforce our point that no amount of imagination can make us believe that these disbursements were made to these people at these locations and at these dates. It is physically impossible. Even assuming that the DepEd has its satellite offices and field personnel all over the country, we should always go back to the joint circular as our Bible. The function of disbursing and of being accountable for the cash advances of the confidential funds is lodged with the SDO and the SDO alone. Delegating this function to any other officer or employee would run counter to the express guidelines of the joint circular and the safeguards that it entails. Unsurprisingly, the same discrepancies have been observed in the OVP acknowledgement receipts, particularly for the payouts and disbursements for the 4th quarter of 2022. For everyone's recollection, this period refers to the 11 days when the OVP was able to use up 125 million pesos worth of confidential funds. And markedly, there were at least 3 days out of those 11 days that the payouts reached 100 recipients. For instance, noon pong December 23, 2022, based on the records and the AR submitted by the OVP to the COA, SDO Gina Acosta was able to disburse more than 15 million pesos to 103 distinct individuals for various purposes. Tila po ba naka-hyperdrive na ang naging pag-disburse ni SDO Acosta para siguruhing ma-expend ang allocated confidential funds sa OVP sa mga nalalabing araw ng 2022. Notably, the following day or Christmas Eve of 2022, these disbursements continued based on the 40 acknowledgement receipts from the OVP on this date. It spent a total of 5,429,000 pesos on supposed confidential activities. Grabe talaga itong OVP non-stop kahit magpapasko na. Whoever disbursed more than 5 billion pesos truly embodied the spirit of generosity during the holidays. If it was actually true, this amount was disbursed for confidential expenses. Lastly, we found acknowledgement receipts that the OVP reported and submitted for the 4th quarter of 2022, but bear dates outside the period for which they are intended to be used as proof. Na-observe po namin how the OVP 4th quarter acknowledgement receipts were dated December 2023, when they have been supposedly paid out to and received by the recipients in 2022. Understandably, a person can instinctively write the past year in documents when welcoming a new year. But we find it very eccentric po, kasi for a person writing a date in 2022 and mistakenly indicating the immediately succeeding year, 2023, wala po yata ibang reason dito except that the acknowledgement receipts were indeed executed in 2023 and not in 2022, contrary to what the OVP is trying to establish. Sa dami po nang na-discover natin in the past hearings na sinubaybayan po ng publiko, we uncovered irregularities and deficiencies in the disbursements and reporting of the confidential funds allocated to the OVP and to the DepEd. This has been an extremely insightful exercise of our mandate as we were able to examine the sufficiency of our current legislation and how this current legislation safeguards us from potential misuse and abuse of public funds, as well as the potential malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance in the office by officers and employees of the government. Our task does not end here. It is now our duty to craft legislation that will protect the public coffers and ensure that they are not used and abused by public servants for their personal agenda. With that, Mr. Chair, I conclude my part of the hearing. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Congressman Gutierrez. Next is Congressman Zia Alonto Adjong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Mr. Chairman and fellow members of this honorable committee, to my fellow Filipinos who are watching right now, what we have witnessed in the past 7 hearings before this Committee on Good Government and Public Accountability of the House of Representatives has left us with more questions than answers. Ang mga tanong po natin dito, hindi nakukuha ang kakulang sagot. Bagkus, nanganganak pa ng maraming tanong. But one thing, Mr. Chairman, is extremely clear to this representation. Tayo po ay na-scam sa pamamagitan ng libu-libong acknowledgement receipts na basta-basta lamang dinoktor or gawa-gawa lamang. Mr. Chair, almost 5,000 acknowledgement receipts of dubious origin, kapalit ang 612.5 million pesos na confidential funds na basta-basta lang naglaho mula sa kaban ng bayan sa ilalim ng pamumuno ng ating Vice Presidente. Mr. Chair, 612,500,000 pesos o mahigit kalahating bilyon. Mr. Chair, ito po ang pondo ng bayan na nawala o hindi ma-explain mula lamang December 2022 hanggang September 2023. 9 na buwan lamang po, Mr. Chairman. Sa ganitong halaga, halos budget na po ng isang buong ahensya para sa isang buong taon ang pinag-uusapan po dito. Pinaglaruan po tayo? Niloko ho ba tayo? O pinaglaruan po ang publiko pagdating sa kanilang pondo? Mr. Chairman, sa item 4.12 ng Joint Circular, ang requirement po sa government agencies na nagdi-disperse ng confidential funds is to submit documentary evidence of payment upon the liquidation at the end of the period for which it was allocated. These documents, Mr. Chairman, are to be submitted to the Intelligence and Confidential Fund Audit Unit of the Commission of Audit, who shall then audit these documents. In fact, upon the submission of the liquidation report to ICFAO, a certification signed by the head of agency and its Special Disbursement Officer, or SDO, stating that the expenses were incurred in connection with the agency's confidential expenses and activities with supporting documents and documentary evidence of payment is needed, Mr. Chairman. As the name suggests, ebidensya, is supposed to prove a fact that the confidential funds were utilized for confidential expenses. Ang hindi dapat basta-basta lang ibinubulsa at hindi dapat lang, Mr. Chairman, dapat lang binubulsa o napupunta lang sa kung ano-anong gastusin. Mr. Chair, from among these documents, this committee discovered that the confidential funds, which should be utilized by civilian agencies for security and surveillance activities, was just handed over to 2 members of the Vice President's security team upon the instruction of the VP herself. Sinabi po ito ng kanyang Special Disbursement Officers na si Ms. Gina Acosta at Mr. Fajarda. Those funds, Mr. Chair, were never to be seen again. And according to the SDOs, these same 2 members of our security group supposedly just provided them with the acknowledgement receipts to be submitted to COA. Ibig sabihin po nito, Mr. Chair, para po mag-comply sa requirement na nag-submit ng documentary evidence of payment, ang binigay ng OVP at DepEd ay acknowledgement receipts lamang. But in the course of investigating the OVP and DepEd submissions to the COA, these acknowledgement receipts, which were supposedly submitted to prove that it actually utilized confidential funds for the purpose stated in its fiscal and financial plan, Mr. Chair, we uncovered a number of anomalies. Sabi ko nga po, ang tanong, nanganganak ng mas maraming tanong. Mukhang ang mga supposed evidence or proof of the use of these confidential funds ay bogus or gawa-gawa lamang. Fake no, ang tawag po sa English. These discoveries led us to the conclusion that something was really amiss, Mr. Chair. May mali na ang pagkakamali na ito ay humahantong po, Mr. Chairman, sa katiwalian. Under Joint Circular 2015-001, it states that confidential funds must be utilized during the period of the particular project. This was confirmed by a resource person, Attorney Gimora, who said during the November 20, 2024 hearing before this committee that she agreed that in relation to the submitted acknowledgement receipts for OVP's confidential funds in December 2022, these do not conform with the period that was covered by the confidential funds. Ito po yung kasagutan niya nung tinanong po siya ng ating kasamahan po dito, si Congressman Jill Bungalon. In the submitted acknowledgement receipts of the OVP to the COA, which as previously mentioned, it was supposedly a proof of its utilization of confidential funds from December 21 to December 31, 2022. And yet, we found numerous receipts which were dated outside of the period. Ibig sabihin, may mga resibuta po tayo dyan na hindi po within the prescribed o tinalagang dates kung saan nagkaroon po ng utilization ng confidential funds. Mr. Chairman, yung confidential funds na dinisburse po ng December 21 to December 31 of 2022 ay mayroon din pong resibo tayong natanggap na dated, na bago pa man ito, Mr. Chair, may mga acknowledgement receipts po tayo na natanggap na ito ay ginasta bago pa man ng December 21, 2022 at mga ibang acknowledgement receipts na nagasta ng December 2023. Ang tanong ko po, Mr. Chairman, sa atin, paano naman ito mangyayari, Mr. Chair? Hindi rin po pwedeng sabihin na para sa ibang confidential funds ito na napasama lang. Because neither the OVP nor the Department of Education had any confidential funds prior to 21 December 2023, nor for December 2023. Wala naman po na confidential funds na binibigay or accordingly gagamitin or gagastahin nung prior, bago nag-December 21, 2023, at wala naman pong confidential funds na allotted for December of 2023. What are shown on the screen, Mr. Chair, are not just the only ones we found, as based on our examination of the acknowledgement receipts. We also found, Mr. Chair, that more than 150 acknowledgement receipts representing payments which amounted to more than 24 million pesos. Mahirap pong paniwalaan, Mr. Chair, na typographical errors ito o nagkamali lang po sa PETSA. Masyado mo naman pong marami siguro ito yung mga typographical errors na ito because it amounts to 150 acknowledgement receipts. Further, in my experience, Mr. Chair, lahat naman ho tayo nagkakamali. Human error ang tawag po natin. Human error as to the writing of the dates would typically be that of the previous year and not of the succeeding year. Ibig sabihin, Mr. Chair, lahat naman ho tayo nagkakamali, lalo lang na pag mga bagong taon. Minsan, hindi pa ho natin masyadong yung acclimatize tayo doon sa pumasok na taon. Ang minsan na susulat po natin ay yung mga nakaraang taon. Hindi po yung preceding year. Na-experience po natin yan as sa human error. Na nagkakamali po tayo bearing the earlier year than the preceding year. Ibig sabihin po, Mr. Chair, hindi yung darating na taon ang may susulat po natin sa mga dokumentong pinipirmahan natin. In fact, Mr. Chair, in the OVP's response to the Audit Observation Memo number 2013-211 and 2013-213, dated 19 October 2023, in which the OVP attached the aforementioned acknowledgement receipts for its December 2022 confidential expenses, it stated that the amount of 125 million pesos was supposedly spent within the period. However, as I previously mentioned, Mr. Chair, a total of 158 acknowledgement receipts submitted by the OVP for its December 2023 confidential funds expenses were made outside the period of December 21 to December 31 of 2022, contrary, Mr. Chair, to the statement of the OVP, Mr. Chair. These acknowledgement receipts were fabricated kasi wala nga po tayong basihan kung bakit ito nagastos. Wala nga ho siya doon sa date kung dapat siya paggastosan. Because they bore dates different from the period covered, Mr. Chair. Simple po yan. Very simple po yan at makikita po ng taong bayan yan. Para daw po sa 21 of December to 31 of December of 2022 raw po ang mga ARs na isinumite. This is shown by the certification dated 10 of January 2023 where Ms. Acosta certified that the acknowledgement receipts submitted, which we just showed, Mr. Chair, was for the period of December 21 to December 21 of 2022. Yung nakuha po ng OVP noong December 20, 2022. Pero po sa mga AR na ito, mayroong pong dalawa. Isa dated November 27, 2022 at isang dated December 12, Mr. Chair, 2022. Ito pong mga petsa na ito, it preceded the date with the confidential funds were released to the OVP in December 2022, while the others are dated in December 2022 or after the funds have been supposedly spent, Mr. Chair. Ang tanong ko po, paano po nangyari yon na meron po silang mga ARs dated prior to the actual releases of the confidential funds at may mga ARs sila dated na after supposedly na na-spent na yung kanilang confidential funds. Bali ho, Mr. Chair, mukhang base po sa sobrang dami ng mga acknowledgement receipts na ito na isinagawa lang noong hinihingan ng ebidensya ng COA sa pinadalang AOM sa Office of the Vice President. Sa aking palagay, Mr. Chair, ay itong panahon lang din na ito nagsimula gumawa ng mga ganitong klaseng acknowledgement receipts ang OVP para isumite. Para po, Mr. Chair, hindi magmukhang ginasta itong confidential expenses kung saan-saan lang po nila nilagay. Mr. Chair, it's very clear, Mr. Chair, kung titingnan po natin ng dates doon sa covered nung request of the confidential funds with that of the acknowledgement receipt na natanggap po natin, mukhang bogus po at fictitious po itong mga confidential funds, Mr. Chair. Wag din ho natin kakalimutan na by its very nature, Mr. Chair, acknowledgement receipts po ito. Ibig sabihin, pipirmahan mo ito tuwing natatanggap mo ang pera. Ibig po ba sabihin ito, Mr. Chair, mahigit 100 tao ang nagkamali na nagsabing December 2023 ang kanilang pinirman habang tinanggap nila ang pera para sa December 2022? Imposible naman po yan mangyari, Mr. Chair, dear colleagues. Let me go to another discovery that we noticed, Another anomaly this committee noticed was the use of a very unique ink in the shade of blue and several acknowledgement receipts mula po sa Office of the Vice President. At first glance, Mr. Chair, we found that these acknowledgement receipts, which supposedly were signed by different persons in different months, clearly have the same unique shade of blue ink. There are many different types of pens, Mr. Chair. Alam po natin yan. May fountain pens, may sign pens, or whatever in the Philippines na available po sa market. But what are the chances, Mr. Chair, that the same ink would be used for 2 or more acknowledgement receipts submitted by the Office of the Vice President? If you ask me, Mr. Chair, the chances are very, very low. Especially, Mr. Chair, kung titingnan nyo po, itong tinta na ito ay hindi mumurahin. Mahal po yan na ballpen. Hindi po yan common na ginagamit na ballpen. Ang mas kapanipaniwala, Mr. Chair, para sa akin, ay only one person probably made this acknowledgement receipts. And they are not the ones who received the funds as indicated in the acknowledgement receipts. Mr. Chair, my staff was also able to find acknowledgement receipts in different names. But the strokes, o yung sinasabi po nating pagkasulat ng kanilang mga signatures, signatures na to were identical. Dalawang different persons but the same identical strokes of signatures. Incidentally, Mr. Chair, these were all done on March of 2023. Moreover, Mr. Chair, the signatures all bear the same figure, done to 2 or 3 times. It's hard to believe, Mr. Chair, that such common signatures would appear like this. I admit that I'm not an expert in this kind of analysis, unlike those at the NBI, kasi sila naman po incompetent gumawa nito na examination. But based on what I know, Mr. Chair, these coincidences are too hard to ignore. In any event, Mr. Chair, ito pong committee na ito ay pinapasuri po natin yan sa NBI to make sure that these signatures are signed by the same person. Titingnan niyo mo po yan sa monitor, the same strokes, different persons. We also found out, Mr. Chair, that 2 acknowledgement receipts, both in the name of Milky Sikuya, both had done on the same day. Same po pinirmahan on the same day, same address in Zambales, and using the same pen. However, have totally different signatures. Tingnan niyo po, magkakaiba. The same day, the same date, same name, but different signatures. Tanong ko po, Mr. Chair, did the person who signed this receipt suddenly forget how they signed in the middle of the same day? Nagkamali ho siya na nakapirma pala siya, tapos pipirma ulit ng isang acknowledgement receipt. Di ba ba, pag naka-receive ka na, hindi ka na ho magpipirma at hindi ka namang mag-receive ng isang another acknowledgement or payment? It could have been acceptable, Mr. Chair, if there was merely a small variance between the signatures. Although, as we can see, these 2 signatures are wholly different from each other. Which only leads to the conclusion, Mr. Chair, that whoever made these ARs was not actually this Milky Sikuya. This is truly mind-boggling, Mr. Chair, to say the least. Another, Mr. Chair, another character who we found is a certain Alice Crescencio. There were 3 different acknowledgement receipts in the name of one Alice Crescencio, submitted by the Department of Education in her name. 3 po yan na acknowledgement receipts from the same agency, Department of Education, bearing the same name. However, Mr. Chair, similar to our friend, tandaan niyo po si Kokoy Villamin na na-present po natin nung previous hearing. Similar to our friend Kokoy Villamin, Mr. Chair, there were 3 different signatures. Kapansin-pansin din po rito, Mr. Chair, na si Miss Alice, was apparently, according to these ARs, were in different parts of the Philippines. Pinirman niya, nung inuna, nasa Pasay City siya. Pangalawa, pumirma siya, nasa Iligan City, sa Mindanao. At doon po sa ang aking probinsya, sa Lanao del Sur. Pumirma din ho siya doon. Baka nandun din siya according to the acknowledgement receipt. So, itong pangalan po ito, Mr. Chair, it leaves a very questions, no? Kaya sabi ko, nanganganak ng tanong. Itong mga pangalan na po ito, Mr. Chair, ay hindi pangkaraniwan. Hindi ho natin masyadong naririnig ang Alice Crescencio. Hindi ho common name ito. Kung Maria, ano man yan, yun ang mga common name. But this is an uncommon name. And the chances are, what are the chances, Mr. Chair, that 3 different individuals, persons, have the same names and spelling? What are the chances, Mr. Chair? All receiving the same confidential funds for different purposes from the same agency, which is DepEd. Sobrang laking coincidence ito, Mr. Chair, which actually, it's a mind-boggling. Medyo po, para sa akin, kung isipin po natin ito, medyo kalokohan. I'm sorry to use the term po. Medyo kalokohan na po ito. The more likely explanation na gusto ko pong isipin ay itong mga taga-pirma o tagagawa nitong mga ARs na ito ay hindi coordinated. Baka hindi ho sila nag-coordinate and they failed to probably overlook the possibility that they may use the same name. No, signing 3 different ARs from 3 different locations bearing gamit ang iisang pangalan, which is, in this case, Alice Crescencio. Mr. Chair, pero hindi po dyan nagtatapos ang mga kababalaghan ang nakikita natin sa acknowledgement receipts. Mr. Chair, it is also these representations. It's my privilege and honor, Mr. Chair, to introduce to you sina Miss Sally at si Miss Sheila. Magkakaibang pangalan po ito, Mr. Chair, at malamang magkakaibang tao. Kaya nga po sila magkaibang pangalan. Pero ano po ang kapansin-pansin, Mr. Chair? At ano ang napapansin natin rito sa pinipirmang acknowledgement receipts nila from DepEd as seen on the screen? Isa lang po ang pirma nila, si Miss Sally at si Miss Sheila. Kabaliktaran po ito ni Kokoy Villamin. Si Kokoy, parehong pangalan pero isa ang pirma. Kabaliktaran po ni Miss Sheila at Miss Sally. Magkaibang pangalan pero parehong pirma. These are 2 different persons, Mr. Chair, from 2 different addresses, I would assume. However, they have the exact same signature with exact same strokes. At baka isang tintang ballpen ang ginamit, Mr. Chair. At magkaibang lugar, Mr. Chair. Nandito po si Manong Johnny, taga Surigao din po siya. So it makes you think, Mr. Chair, that what are again the chances? That once again, the 2 different people from Digos City and Surigao City being more than 400 kilometers away from each other, have the same exact name and the same signature. 2 people signing the same acknowledgement receipts, 2 different people signing with the same signatures in 2 different locations which are 400 kilometers apart from each other. Taga Mindanao po ako, so alam ko po yung gaano kalayo ang Digos at ang Surigao. For me, Mr. Chair, only 1 person did these acknowledgement receipts, but merely changed his handwriting style from print to script in writing, the name and the addresses, but also forgetting, Mr. Chair, probably to change the signature. Yun lang po ang aking naiisip na possible na answer. And because of this, Mr. Chair, I believe that this receipt was again merely fabricated. We have all been introduced to our new characters, Mr. Chair, si Alice, Crescencio, Milky Way si Kuya, Sally, and Miss Sheila. But let us not also forget our original friends na pinakilala ng committee na ito. One of the stars on the issue, Mr. Chair, of the confidential fund is one Mr. Kokoy Villamin. Na-mention ko po sa inyo earlier, and this was also presented in the previous hearings. Mr. Kokoy Villamin, who happens to receive confidential funds from both the OVP and the DepEd. Kung maalala niyo po, Mr. Chair, si Mr. Kokoy Villamin ay ang isa sa mga unang napansin ng committee ito marahil sa kanyang kakaibang pangalan at sa magkaiba-ibang kanyang mga pirma. Napanood din po natin, Mr. Chair, at napanood ng committee ito ang interview kay PSA Assistant National Statistician Mariza Grande na tinitingnan nila ang pangalan niya sa kanilang records at isiniwalat niya na wala silang makitang records pertaining to Mr. Kokoy Villamin. This was brought about by the request of Congresswoman Jinky Luistro na para po ma-confirm natin na may talagang tao nito, we need to seek the assistance of PSA and NBI. Pero according sa kanila, wala po silang records na may tao pong Mr. Kokoy Villamin. According kay PSA na Assistant National Statistician na Mariza Grande. Base po sa kanilang initial na findings na ito ng PSA, mas panatag ako, Mr. Chair, na ang confidential funds na di umano'y binigay kay Mr. Villamin ay hindi talaga sa kanya napunta at hindi talaga itong totoong tao. I mean, common sense would dictate, Mr. Chair, that same name, bearing the same name, ay hindi po magkakaroon ng 2 signatures. And it reinforces our original questions kung meron po bang mga taong ganito. Ang pinakabida, Mr. Chair, sa ating naging inquiry in aid of legislation sa committee ito ay of course, si Miss Mary Grace Piatos. Thank you to Chairman Romy Acop, siya po yung unang nakaobserba at na-notice po niya ang pangalan. Dahil yung pangalan pong ito, ang una nating napansin, at napansin ni Chairman Acop, dahil ito po ay kombinasyon, according to him, ng isang restaurant at chichirya. At tama na po, lahat po tayo nag-agree noon. Nung inaisiwalat sa committee ito ang acknowledgement receipt ni Ms. Mary Grace Piatos, kami ay tunay na mangha. Tayo po, hindi lang po tayo, ang buong bayan ng namangha. We reached out to the National Statistics Authority and inquired from them into whether this was a real person or a made-up character. We were likewise informed, Mr. Chair, that the NSA had no record of any person bearing the name of Mary Grace Piatos. There are certain personalities, Mr. Chair, who claim this Mary Grace Piatos were merely a code name, adding that in television and in movies, sa mga palabas at sa television, these code names are used for secret mission. But the fugitive, and I address to him directly in hiding, forgets that this is real life. Tunay po tayong nag-iimbestiga dito, hindi po ito television, hindi po ito palabas. That the people's money, earned through the hard work of every Filipino, should be scrutinized on how they were spent by our agencies. Mr. Chair, ang keyword, Mr. Chair, is transparency. Transparency is required kasi kailangan masilip ng otoridad, gaya ng COA, o kaya't ang taong bayan kung nasa tama ba ang paggastos ng kanilang pondo. In this particular case, the confidential funds. The PSA recently informed us, Mr. Chair, that our new friends, Mr. Kokoy Villamin, Ms. Milky Sikuya, and Ms. Alice Crescencio, are also all non-existent. Wala po silang record. Non-existent. Hindi po sila, according to PSA, ay posibleng hindi po ito mga tao. There is no record of their birth, no record of their marriage, contracts, whatsoever, or death. No, sana naman po, hindi death, no? Although we just want to leave no stone unturned. That's why we request them if they have a proof that would really prove an evidence of their existence. Birth, marriage, or even death certificates. Wala po, according to PSA. In fact, Mr. Chairman, of the 677 names from the DepEd acknowledgement receipts, which we submitted to the PSA for verification, para po patunayan na kung mayroon bang tao na ganito, the 677 names from the ARs, it was determined by the PSA, Mr. Chair, that only 405 of these ARs with these names have no record whatsoever. So malaki-laki po yung persyento, 677. Out of the 677, 405 ang wala pong verifikasyon at wala pong record ng PSA. So, Mr. Chair, it is unlikely that all of these are merely code names, as some supposedly high-powered lawyer would claim, that this simply would not make sense from a legal standpoint, which we will discuss more, Mr. Chair, and from a practical perspective, since it would be an unbelievable, unimaginable amount of effort to do. Imagine, Mr. Chair, gumawa ka, mag-imbento ka ng ganyang karamihang pangalan. At let us go back to Alice Crescencio, if assuming without conceding that these are code names. Di ba pag mga code names po, ibig sabihin you somehow protect the real identity of the person. That's why you're using code names. Itatanungin ko po, ilang beses silang kumukuha ng code name sa sina-assign sa isang tao? Halimbawa, si Alice Crescencio, 3 beses pumirma sa magkakaibang lugar ng ARs. How would they find out if Miss Alice Crescencio is assigned to a particular person kung 3 beses nila itong ginamit? Kung tanamang, if assuming that what they're saying is true, how sloppy they are to work and assign 3 code names to same code name to 3 different persons. Mr. Chair, under item 4.15.3 of the joint circular expressly requires that the SDO certify to the fact that such supporting documents for confidential funds are kept in a vault, while item 6.2.21 of the same joint circular requires that liquidation reports along with supporting documents like the acknowledgement receipts, are required to be submitted in a sealed envelope. Ibig sabihin, ang sinasabi po dito sa joint circular, kinakailangan po na mag-certify ang SDO na may supporting documents ang confidential funds at nilalagay po sa vault para hindi po basta-basta may labas yan. At sinasabi din ho dito sa sa joint circular na ang liquidation reports ay dapat may supporting documents. Hindi lang po ang ARs, no? At nilalagay po yan sa sealed envelope. Ganun po kaimportante yan. Ang mga requirements po na ito, Mr. Chair, ay tiyak na alam ng mga staff po ng opisina ng Vice President at ng Department of Education. In fact, Mr. Chair, to prove that they know this circular, the requirement of this circular memorandum, sinabi po ni Ms. Gina Acosta, in a certification dated 10 January of 2022, certified si Ms. Acosta that the details and supporting documents relating to use of confidential funds are kept in safe. Sinabi po niya yan, na nilalagay po nila as a way to observe what is required of them to do. This includes, Mr. Chair, the acknowledgement receipt of Ms. Mary Grace Piatos, according to her. So ang tanong ko po, Mr. Chair, kung meron pong stricto ang joint circular na dapat ilagay sa safe, sa vault, the joint circular uses the term vault, no? And uses also the terms and the phrase supporting documents. E di para saan pa kaya ang security measures na ito sa joint circular kung code names lang din pala ang gagamitin? Bakit ilalagay pa sa envelope kung hindi naman sigurado na totoong tao yun kasi code name pala? Sa madaling salita, Mr. Chair, what is the use of the requirement under the joint circular of keeping records locked in a safe and transmitting them via an envelope marked confidential funds kung hindi pala tunay na tao? Kung code names yan, pwede mo naman po nakalagay yan sa mesa. Malay mo ba natin kung sino si Alice Crescencio? Ano ba tunay niyang pangalan? Diba? If we are really to protect their identity. So why there's a need for the joint circular to require the agency to keep it in a safe and then have acknowledgement receipt and then put it in a sealed envelope? If these receipts, Mr. Chair, actually used,
Actually, there are 3 safeguard. Number 1, it must be sealed. May nakalagay na confidential at dapat nakalagay sa vault.
yes. And those 3 requirements were already confirmed by Ms. Gina Acosta, Mr. Chair, in the previous hearing. Mr. Chair, again, let me continue. If these receipts actually use code names, what is the point locking it in a safe, again, and secure the vault and secure it in the vault? When the details therein have already been obscured or changed, pinalitan na hindi niya tunay na identity. Halimbawa, si Congressman Paulo Ortega, ang kanyang code name ay si Magneto. Pwede naman dyan nakalagay dyan. Malay ba natin na si Magneto pala si Congressman Paulo Ortega? Mr. Chair, the interpretation offered by those who claim that code names can be used is patently absurd. I'm sorry to say this. And we in government, Mr. Chair, cannot and should not dabble with the absurd. Hindi dapat ito biro, hindi biro ang pinag-uusapan dito. Hindi lang naglalaro dito, Mr. Chair. Seryosong bagay po ito. Kaya nga po may joint circular Kasi seryoso po ang gobyerno kung paano po nilalagay ang criteria kung paano gastusin po ang pondo ng taong bayan, ang pera ng ating mga kababayan. So hindi po ito dapat laro-laro at hindi po lang dapat itago sa mga code names. Furthermore, Mr. Chair, just because the issue involves confidential funds doesn't mean we can ignore, exploit, and essentially invent acknowledgement receipts, which under the joint circular are proof of payment. Paano po mapoprove na itong isang tao na ito, nagngangalang ganito, ay nakatanggap dahil siya informant, kung ang nilalagay lang ho natin na acknowledgement receipts ay hindi niya pangalan or code name lang, Mr. Chair, Your Honors. How can we then confirm, especially COA, Mr. Chair, that the confidential fund actually went to the right person for the stated purpose if the amount can be claimed with a code name? Mr. Chair, how can the Commission audit ensure that the agency who utilized confidential funds actually utilized it for its actual stated purpose, as allowing a code name, Mr. Chair, to me, just allows this, Mr. Chair, to be prone to abuse, but just writing any name and calling it as such, Mr. Chair. And when accountability is required from the agency of the government, the inquiry will be brushed aside only on the basis of supposed confidentiality. Ganun po eh. So we are actually weakening not only COA, but even this committee, the inherent right of this committee to exercise its oversight function. Para lang ho, Mr. Chair, to me, para lang ho itong biro-biro lamang lang. So I think those are the things that we need to consider and probably to propose a bill that would really secure the identity of the informants and as well as to prove that those informants really do receive the payments. Ilan lang po, Mr. Chairman, ito sa mga anomalyang napansin natin sa ating pag-imbestiga, sa mga documentary evidences of payment na isinumite ng Office of the Vice President at ng Department of Education para di umano'y magpapatunay sa paggamit ng confidential expenses nito. Sa aming mga kababayan, to my fellow Filipinos, I would wish that this committee's inquiry in aid of legislation with regard to the issues on confidential funds surrounding OVP and DepEd was understood. Pinapanalangin ko po, Mr. Chair, na maintindihan ito ang trabaho po natin at ginagawa po natin dito sa committee nito. Pinapanalangin ko na maintindihan ito ng ating mga kababayan. Dahil hindi po ito pondo ng isang taong pinag-uusapan. Hindi po biro ang pinag-uusapan dito. Hindi po madali ang mga na-involved na tao po dito. Ito po ang pinag-uusapan natin ay pondo po nila. Pera po ng taong bayan. And we want to make sure that whatever manners these funds are spent and utilized, it should ultimately be for the goal or objective of making their lives better. If we, Mr. Chair, as lawmakers, do not adhere to our duty to inquire with resource speakers which are aimed at addressing gaps in the law, we would not be able to pass bills to eventually become law to address these very gaps which are prone to abuse. Ang ginagawa po natin dito, at kung hindi natin ginagawa at ine-exercise ang ating oversight function, paano po tayo makakagawa ng batas para protektahan ang pera ng ating mga kababayan? This is exactly what we, Mr. Chair, this committee, as lawmakers, as legislators have done here. And this is the primary reason of why we have undergone numerous hearings in our inquiry in aid of legislation with regard to confidential funds without fear or favor. Mr. Chair, in closing, other than our goal of hopefully passing a bill to address these gaps in the law surrounding confidential funds so that this may not be abused again by those in power, we should not forget who facilitated this abuse, Mr. Chair. Sabi ko nga, hindi po madali itong investigasyon na ito dahil ang involved po ay matataas na opisyal ng ating gobyerno. There's only one person, Mr. Chair, in the middle of the issues surrounding the anomalous utilization of confidential funds of the Office of the Vice President and the Department of Education. Ang tinuturo po ng lahat na naging bisita po natin dito sa committee ito. The very last invitees na nag-appear po sa committee ito, ang Special Disbursement Officers ng Department of Education nung kapanahunan po niya at ng Office of the Vice President. Ito po yung inatasan under the Joint Circular Memorandum nung pag-disburse, paggamit ng confidential funds. Sila lang po ang merong kapangyarihan na mag-disburse at mag-implement nitong pondo na ito. At sila pong dalawa, ang sinabi po nila na nag-utos po sa kanila ay ating pangalawang Pangulo, Vice President Sara Duterte. Mr. Chair, wala pong personalan ito. Trabaho lang. Marami pong salamat. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Congressman Sia.